Winter 1944 had a way of making time feel heavier. Snow packed the shoulders of the Ardennes roads and turned every bend into a bottleneck. Engines labored in the cold, wheels spun on ice, vehicles slid into ditches that looked harmless until they swallowed an axle. For weeks, the Allied advance had carried the quiet confidence of momentum, Germany retreating, the end appearing on the horizon like a distant light. Then, in mid-December, the German offensive struck out of the forest, and confidence did not fade gradually. It snapped. At Chef, war arrived as paper and pins. Under lamps and cigarette haze, frontline reports were converted into symbols, arrows, unit markers, penciled annotations that kept moving when they were not supposed to. The lines on the map did not merely shift, they tore. Like a wound reopening, the bulge expanded hour by hour, each update marking a village lost, a bridge threatened, a supply column forced off its route. In a modern army, minutes are fuel and blood. In a coalition army, minutes are also trust. Dwight D. Eisenhower listened with the stillness of a man trained to hide the cost of what he knows. Briefings did not need drama. The facts were dramatic enough. And then came the phrase that outweighed every other detail, spoken plainly, almost clinically, because there was no better way to say it. Bastogne is surrounded. On the map, it was a small town. On the ground, it was a junction of roads in the winter, which meant it was a junction of fate. If it held, the German thrust could be slowed. If it fell, the enemy's advance could breathe. Across the room sat George S. Patton. He did not look surprised. His notebook was already open, already crowded with routes and timings, as if the crisis had been a scheduled appointment rather than a shock. Patton's mind often ran ahead of events, not as prophecy, but as habit. He believed speed was not something you improvised. It was something you built in advance, like a bridge you would one day need in the dark. A staff officer finally voiced what hovered over the table. The only immediate counterweight to the German breakthrough might be to turn an entire army, Patton's third, north. Not in weeks, in days. Roads were iced, traffic was already choking, and the enemy had chosen this moment precisely because it seemed impossible to respond quickly. Eisenhower's face tightened for a fraction of a second, then returned to the calm mask coalition command required. Fear in such rooms could not be displayed. It had to be converted into procedure, orders, priorities, decisions that would hold the alliance together while the front threatened to split it apart. The wager formed without ceremony. If Patton could move in 2 days, the bulge could be contained. If he could not, winter might do what German armor alone could not, turn Allied unity into something brittle. And as the meeting ended, one question hung in the air like frost. Was Patton's speed a gift to the war, or a force that even Eisenhower might struggle to control? George S. Patton had built his reputation on a single conviction: movement wins wars. To him, speed was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a doctrine with moral weight. The longer a battle lasted, the more men died slowly, in cold mud or behind hedgerows, not in grand charges, but in anonymous arithmetic. Patton believed pressure was a kind of mercy. If you moved faster than the enemy could think, you shortened the suffering. Surprise was not theater. It was efficiency. Dwight D. Eisenhower believed something different, and it was no less demanding. His battlefield was the alliance itself, an American army, a British army, Canadians, Free French, and others, each with pride, politics, and competing memories of past wars. Eisenhower's genius was not in the sprint, but in the holding together. Logistics, legitimacy, and unity were the three pillars he guarded, because if anyone failed, the front line could hold, and still the war could be lost in conference rooms and capitals. Patton fought to break the enemy's will. Eisenhower fought to keep the coalition's will from breaking first. They trusted each other, but they were not made of the same weather. Patton's temperament thrived on friction, on uncertainty, on the charged atmosphere where a bold decision could change a map before the enemy had time to redraw it. Eisenhower's temperament was shaped by the opposite responsibility: to prevent chaos from spreading, to ensure that one man's brilliance did not become another man's disaster. In a coalition, a single uncontrolled movement could cause a traffic jam that became a strategic failure, or a political rupture that no battlefield victory could repair. Patton's Third Army, often described as his instrument, was introduced best as a system, trained to move as if time were ammunition. Fuel discipline was enforced like religion. March tables were treated like contracts. Staff work was drilled until it became instinct. Units practiced rapid shifts and contingency plans not for elegance, but because Patton understood the paradox of speed. It is only possible when it is prepared in advance. Delay in that culture was not inconvenience. It was defeat arriving early. Eisenhower's headquarters was another kind of machine. It coordinated not only armies, but nations, not only divisions, but air power, shipping, railheads, and political constraints that never appeared on a battlefield map. Decisions had to satisfy military reality and diplomatic necessity at the same time. An offensive could be tactically sound and strategically poisonous if it humiliated a partner or strained a supply line beyond repair. Eisenhower's calm was not softness. It was load-bearing. In dim corridors outside the briefing rooms, a courier ran with folders pressed to his chest, boots striking the floor with urgency softened by protocol. Orders moved hand to hand, stamped and signed, then translated into engines starting in the dark. It was a small image, almost invisible beside the scale of the war. Yet it carried the truth of modern command. History is often moved by paper in a war of steel. And now that machinery, Patton's speed and Eisenhower's control, was about to be tested against the same question. The fastest general in Europe was becoming a strategic emergency tool, used by the one commander who could not afford a single loose thread. The pivot north was not only a march. It was a relationship under stress, between motion and management, between the urge to charge forward and the duty to keep the entire war coherent. Weeks before the Ardennes erupted, the war on the Western Front had settled into a rhythm that felt almost dependable. Towns fell, bridges were repaired, supply dumps crept forward, and the maps at headquarters showed steady progress. That sense of momentum carried its own danger. In long campaigns, familiarity becomes a narcotic. Men begin to believe the enemy is finished simply because the enemy is retreating. Yet Patton, for all his appetite for bold movement, was never naive about what a cornered army could do. He had seen enough history to know that a wounded opponent can still strike hardest when it has the least to lose. In Third Army headquarters, preparation did not look like inspiration. It looked like rehearsal. Staff officers built contingency plans the way engineers build supports, quietly, methodically, without applause. Routes were studied not as lines on a map, but as living systems. Bridges with weight limits, villages with narrow streets, hills that could freeze into impassable grades overnight. Timetables were written and rewritten. Units practiced rapid shifts of direction because Patton understood something most commanders learned too late. Speed is purchased in advance, paid for with boredom and discipline long before it is needed in crisis. On the roads behind the front, routines became doctrine. March discipline was enforced with relentless consistency, spacing between vehicles, halts timed to the minute, breakdown procedures drilled until they became reflex. Military police learned traffic control not as a sideline, but as an art, because a single wrong turn could ripple backward into hours of lost time. Refueling cycles were organized with the precision of a factory line, where the fuel would be, how long it would take, how to keep columns moving without clogging the arteries of the army. None of it made headlines, none of it looked heroic, but it was the invisible foundation of what the world would later call an overnight miracle. Eisenhower's worries lived at a different altitude. He saw the Western Front as a long, stretched band of responsibility, hundreds of miles of lines that had to be held through winter weather and political pressure. He knew that the Allied advance, impressive as it was, carried weaknesses. Supply lines were long, the ports were limited, and winter could turn a routine resupply into a crisis. Above all, he feared complacency. In coalition war, complacency is not simply laziness. It is vulnerability disguised as confidence, and it invites an enemy to gamble. German intentions, in those weeks, were not fully understood. Intelligence was imperfect. Weather-grounded aircraft, reduced reconnaissance, muffled the signals of movement. The Ardennes looked quiet, and quietness can be mistaken for weakness. Many believed the Germans were exhausted, that they lacked fuel, that they could not mount a serious offensive. The front appeared stable until it wasn't. Stability, it turned out, was merely the shape of the unknown. Somewhere on a dark road, far from the briefing rooms, a driver studied a new route under blackout conditions, memorizing turns and landmarks he could barely see. He did not know his road would soon matter. He only knew that orders demanded readiness, and readiness meant familiarity with the landscape even in darkness. In wars of machines, the human memory of a road can become a lifeline. That is the early revelation hidden inside the later legend. Improvisation at this scale is usually rehearsed perfection. When Patton would later pivot an army north, the motion would look like genius under pressure. In truth, it would be the delayed reward of weeks of quiet preparation. And so the cold open irony settles into place. The war's biggest surprise in the West would be met by the commander who trained as if surprises were guaranteed, because he never confused a quiet front with a harmless one. In the Ardennes, the enemy was about to prove how wrong complacency could be, and Patton was about to prove how expensive readiness could become. December 1944 came with a quiet that misled the front. In the Ardennes, pine forests swallowed sound, snow softened ruts, and low cloud kept aircraft on the ground. It looked like a sector for rest, not for decision. That illusion was the first weapon the Germans used. Before dawn on 16th December, artillery shattered the stillness, and German columns pushed through gaps the Allies had left thin. Panthers and assault guns led where roads allowed. Infantry moved where roads did not. The attack was built as much on psychology as on firepower. Surprise to create panic, pressure to create rumors, speed to make the map lie before staff officers could correct it. The aim was not simply to win a battle. Hitler's planners wanted to seize the Meuse crossings, reach Antwerp, and split the British and American armies like boards pried apart. If the coalition could be made to argue, to retreat on separate roads, to distrust each other's intentions, then Germany might force a negotiated peace, or at least a pause long enough to breathe. In winter, even a pause could be a victory. Allied command reeled because the front was a system, and systems fail at their joints. Supply depots were suddenly too far forward. Fuel convoys met roadblocks made of wrecked trucks and refugees. Telephone lines snapped under shell fire. Radios crowded with overlapping calls. Weather thickened the confusion, turning the air arm quiet at the moment it was most needed. The Germans did not have to destroy everything, they only had to displace it. Patton read the offensive differently. Concentration, he believed, was also exposure. By driving into the Ardennes, the enemy had narrowed his own options and shown his flanks to anyone who could move fast enough to strike them. The Germans were betting the Allies would react slowly, bound by procedure and winter roads. To Patton, that bet was an invitation, almost a taunt. Prove them wrong by arriving where they did not expect an entire army. Eisenhower saw the larger danger that sat behind the tactical crisis. If the line collapsed, credibility collapsed with it. Allies might begin to protect their own sectors first, to hoard reserves, to question orders that seemed to favor another nation's front. The German offensive was aimed at trust as much as terrain. A coalition is powerful, but it is also delicate. It can win wars and still break under strain. Inside the bulge, a surrounded platoon learned what that strain felt like. They heard rumors instead of orders. Fragments passed from man to man. The Germans were everywhere. The Americans were retreating. Relief was impossible. Uncertainty spread faster than bullets because it filled every pause between shots. In those first hours, both sides believed they were about to prove a thesis. Germany believed Allied unity was brittle. Patton believed speed could restore reality. Eisenhower believed unity was the only reality worth saving. And somewhere on those frozen roads, the next decision was already moving. North of the breach, men at Bastogne waited, counting ration tins and listening for engines that were not theirs. In headquarters, the question was no longer whether to respond, but who could respond in time at all. In the emergency conference, the room felt smaller than the maps. Outside, December wind worried the windows. Inside, attaching voices kept to professional tones. Reports from the Ardennes arrived in fragments, but the meaning was whole. The German thrust was growing, and Bastogne sat inside it like a knot. Eisenhower asked what could be done, and before anyone finished calculating, Patton leaned forward, already holding his answer, as if the clock started when he sat down. He did not offer a speech. He offered a time. "I can attack toward Bastogne in 2 days," he said, and the statement landed with the dull weight of something either brilliant or reckless. Patton insisted it was neither prophecy nor bravado. His staff had rehearsed pivots, his march tables were drafted, fuel points identified, routes reconnoitered. The move, he implied, was already built, only waiting to be used. That was doctrine. Speed is prepared, not discovered under fire. Around the table, reactions divided along a familiar line. Some officers heard a solution, the rare kind that arrives complete, like a bridge thrown across a river overnight. Others heard Patton's old temptation, confidence that could harden into arrogance, urgency that could ignore collateral strain. In war, genius and ego often share the same voice. Only results separate them, and results are paid for in men and gasoline. No one could afford mistakes now either. Eisenhower did what he always did, translated claims into logistics. He looked at the distances, the narrow winter roads, the choke points where one broken half-track could freeze a corps behind it. He pictured traffic jams of tanks, trucks, ambulances, artillery, all competing for the same lanes while German pressure tightened. Time, for him, was not rhetoric. It was a balance sheet of risk. Fuel spent, units exposed, plans disrupted, credibility measured in hours on every front. Yet even as Eisenhower measured, Patton's headquarters was already moving. Staff officers stepped into hallways and spoke in low, clipped sentences. Telephones rang. Route cards were pulled from folders as if the decision had been made yesterday. No one announced an order, but units began to prepare to reverse. Speed, in Third Army, was not something you requested politely. It was a habit that started before permission arrived, because delay was its own enemy. This was the hidden truth behind the phrase, 2 days. It was not one march, not one heroic dash up a single highway. It was thousands of synchronized decisions. Which division moved first? Where engineers would clear ice and repair bridges, how fuel would be rationed so lead elements did not stall, how military police would turn crossroads into one-way valves. At that scale, minutes were created by planning and lost by hesitation. Choices meshed like gears inside a watch. Eisenhower finally fixed the wager into policy. Patton would turn north, strike, and try to open the road to Bastogne. The order was simple, the gamble was not. If Third Army failed, the attempt would burn fuel. The Allies could not easily replace, exhaust men running on rations, and leave the shoulders of the bulge weaker for the enemy's next push. If it worked, it would rewrite the winter's story, and the meeting ended with engines starting. Eisenhower's first instinct was not revenge, not drama, but containment. The German thrust had to be held at the shoulders before it widened into a rupture that no reserve could stitch. He needed the northern flank to stand, the southern flank to stand, and the rear areas to keep functioning like a living body. Railheads, depots, field hospitals, headquarters, all of it. Panic was the true accelerant. If units began retreating without orders, the roads would become a second battlefield, and the enemy would win without firing another round. Yet containment required movement as well as restraint, and that was the contradiction Eisenhower lived inside. Patton's speed could save Bastogne, but speed without coordination could also choke the entire Allied road network. One corps rushing north on the wrong route could block another corps meant to seal the gap. A brilliant dash could turn into a traffic jam of tanks, trucks, and ambulances trapped in ice and fog. Eisenhower did not fear boldness. He feared boldness colliding with other boldness, producing only friction and delay. Above the tactical picture sat the political one, heavier and harder to move. The Germans were not merely trying to take ground, they were trying to split the coalition that had crossed France together. British and American commanders had to believe the plan served the whole front, not one national pride. If London suspected Washington of gambling recklessly, or if American generals believed the British were pulling back to protect themselves, then Hitler's deepest objective would be met: division. In coalition war, distrust spreads the way winter spreads, quietly and then everywhere. So Eisenhower's authority had to function like moral architecture. It could not rely on volume or personal legend. It had to be obeyed because it made sense, because it treated partners fairly, because it kept promises. His power was the power of coherence, a single direction imposed on many armies, many egos, many governments. Logistics and legitimacy were not separate tasks. They were the same task seen from different angles. Unity was not a slogan. Unity was survival. In the briefing room, Eisenhower chose his words with the care of a man handling glass. He could not sound desperate, even if the situation demanded desperation. Desperation makes commanders improvise alone. He needed them to improvise together. He asked for measures, not miracles, for timetables, not boasts. When he turned to Patton, he did not flatter him. He defined his mission, and by defining it, he contained it. That was the deeper lesson of the moment. Leadership in a coalition is often the art of granting freedom while maintaining a single compass bearing. Eisenhower would let Patton attempt the impossible, but inside a framework that protected the rest of the line. He accepted the risk because the alternative, hesitation, fragmentation, and a widening bulge, was worse. And as Patton's columns began to pivot north, Eisenhower's war became a test of whether speed could be made obedient to strategy. Behind every arrow he drew, Eisenhower ordered corridors cleared, road space, fuel priority, liaison officers, constant reports. He held Montgomery and Bradley to one plan, then released Patton into it. The next 48 hours would be fought in headquarters and on icy intersections before firing began. Third Army did not pivot like a car turning at an intersection. It pivoted like a city rerouting its lifeblood. On orders signed in the late hours, columns that had been facing east toward the German border stopped, reversed, and began flowing north toward the Ardennes. At crossroads, military police planted themselves in snowbanks with lanterns and boards, converting civilian lanes into one-way arteries. A wrong turn was no longer a nuisance. It was a strategic wound. In the dark, trucks, half-tracks, and tanks learned a new geography, mile by disciplined mile, while staff clocks ticked and radios murmured corrections. Movement at this scale was choreography, not haste. March tables specified who moved first, who yielded the road, and where each unit would pause without blocking the next. Fuel points appeared like islands, 50-gallon drums stacked under tarps, pumps manned through the night, drivers briefed to top off and roll on. Maintenance teams waited at pre-selected pullouts, ready to change a track pin or replace a fan belt before a breakdown became a traffic jam. Recovery vehicles prowled the shoulders, dragging dead trucks aside so the column could keep breathing. Behind them, clerks updated manifests, counting gallons like lives today. Winter fought every calculation. Ice glazed bridges and made braking a gamble. Fog erased landmarks and compressed visibility to a few truck lengths. Snow muffled engines and hid ditches until a wheel dropped and the entire timetable shuddered. Yet discipline turned weather into a factor, not a fate. Units carried chains, sand, and shovels. Engineers checked spans ahead of the heaviest armor. MPs enforced spacing so skids did not become pileups. The Army did not ask for clear skies. It learned to move inside the storm, as if the storm were enemy fire, and kept the schedule hour after hour. One driver, hunched over the wheel in blackout conditions, understood the maneuver in a simpler language. He could not see the horizon, only the dim tail lights ahead, hooded to a faint red glow. He followed them like scripture, because faith here was practical. Lose the vehicle in front, and you might miss a turn. Miss a turn, and you might block a bridge. Block a bridge, and hundreds behind you would freeze in place. In the cab, breath fogged the glass. Outside, the forest watched, indifferent, as the war tried to hurry, and every mile felt borrowed from tomorrow. Above the columns, Patton's staff enforced simplicity. Orders were short, typed, repeated, and carried by multiple channels because one broken radio could not be allowed to stop an army. Priorities were ruthless. Combat commands first, then engineers, then fuel, then everything else that could follow later. Liaison officers moved between headquarters to prevent misunderstandings that might turn into gridlock. When a village street narrowed, routes were shifted before the choke formed. When a bridge failed, alternate crossings were already penciled in. The miracle, if it came, would come from this quiet math, done by men who never appeared in photographs. Many later described the pivot as Patton's personal will made visible, but will alone does not regulate intersections. The innovation was structural, a headquarters that could compress decisions, a road network controlled like a weapon, and units trained to treat instructions as life preservers. Speed was manufactured, not demanded. It was built from rehearsals, checklists, and the unromantic authority of the schedule. Shouting could not clear ice, repair a clutch, or untangle a convoy. Systems could. In the Ardennes winter, organization became a form of firepower, striking the enemy by arriving before he expected contact, turning surprise back on him. As the hours passed, the roads filled with a steady, almost impersonal momentum. A battalion knew only its interval, a fuel officer only his quota, an MP only his junction, yet the whole mass advanced with a single intention. Thousands of men moved faster than any one man's imagination, because training had already bound them into one instrument. They did not need to understand the entire design. They needed to keep their part in time. That is how modern armies perform miracles, not by transcending reality, but by aligning it. But tempo has a price, and tired eyes proved it. By the second night, the pivot became a test of endurance. Drivers gripped wheels with numb fingers, gunners slept sitting up, officers counted miles like prayers. The column kept its spacing and halts because discipline was the only barrier between fatigue and collapse. Somewhere ahead lay Bastogne, and inside Bastogne men were already cold, already surrounded, already waiting. The road between them was being carved out minute by minute. Yet speed had its own weakness. One wrecked truck, one iced bridge, one missed signal at a crossroads, and the whole movement could lock in place. Fragile motion, the cost followed. An army can be measured in tanks and trucks, but in winter it is measured in hours of sleep. As Third Army drove north, engines ran without pause, and men learned to rest in fragments. 10 minutes with a helmet pulled over the eyes, a brief doze against a frozen canvas seat, then back to the wheel. The body became part of the logistics equation. Hunger, cold, and fatigue were no longer private discomforts. They were variables that could slow a convoy, blur a judgment, turn a safe distance into a collision. Speed demanded not only fuel, but nervous systems that could still obey. Patton's leadership style made endurance a moral expectation. He did not ask gently. He demanded, and the demand carried its own logic. Delay meant Bastonia's defenders would bleed longer, and a longer fight meant more dead men on both sides. In that reasoning, relentless pressure became a kind of harsh compassion. Yet it also created a quiet burden. Men did not merely follow orders, they carried them physically, in stiff backs and burning eyes, in hands that shook slightly from exhaustion when they lit a cigarette. The line between necessary hardness and needless cruelty was thin, and it was never drawn on any map. On the roadside, the march looked less like triumph than like work. Soldiers ate cold rations crouched in ditches, using the embankment as windbreak, chewing quickly because the halt was timed, and the next unit was coming behind them. Cans were opened with bayonets, bread turned brittle in the air, coffee lukewarm before it touched the tongue. Then, without complaint, they climbed back into trucks. Time was visible now, not as a clock face, but as miles still untraveled and reports still arriving from Bastonia. Inside Bastonia, those reports were felt as absence. The town was surrounded, the temperature biting, ammunition counted, fuel scarce. Men in foxholes listened to German engines and the thud of shells that did not need to be accurate to be exhausting. They waited for the sky to clear, for supplies, for the sound that meant the world was pushing back. Hope became a measurement of distance. How far is relief? How fast can it move? How many nights until it arrives? At Schaif, Eisenhower watched the reports arrive like heartbeats. Each update meant a unit had closed another stretch of road, another choke point had been cleared, another small clash had not stalled the larger movement. He read numbers, miles, hours, positions, but behind them was a living thing, momentum, and momentum, once lost, is difficult to restore. He needed Patton not merely to move, but to arrive in a condition capable of fighting when he got there. The paradox tightened with every mile. The faster an army moves, the more fragile it becomes. One wrecked bridge can ruin the miracle. One convoy stuck on an icy hill can delay the fuel that delays the tanks, that delays the contact, that delays the relief. Speed compresses time, but it also compresses margin for error until there is almost none left. That was the price of 2 days, not only exhaustion, but vulnerability. By now the pivot was no longer a plan. It was a living strain running through men and machines. The decisive question moved closer with the columns. Could speed become contact, and could contact become relief before Bastonia's ring tightened into something unbreakable? Winter weather did more than freeze roads. It erased the sky. Low cloud and fog kept fighters and bombers grounded, denying the Allies their usual advantage in air power. Commanders were forced back into an older kind of war, fought with what they could see, what they could reach by road, and what they could still supply under ice and shell fire. In that narrowed world, every decision became heavier, because there were fewer tools to correct mistakes. Artillery became the glue that held the pivot together. Fire missions were planned like appointments, timed to movement and terrain, with guns shifting forward only when fuel and road capacity allowed. A battery could not simply be there if the bridges behind it were jammed. The sequence mattered. Clear the route, move the fuel, move the guns, then move the infantry into the space the shells had opened. It was not romantic, but it was decisive. Precision replacing the air cover the weather had stolen. The Germans understood choke points as well as the Allies did. They tried to harden villages and crossroads into knots of resistance, forcing the moving columns to slow and unravel. Each town became a test of tempo. Would Patton's thrust keep flowing, or would it be pinned down by a handful of guns placed on the right bend of the right road? In the Ardennes, Geography could be weaponized by any side that arrived first. Along one shelled stretch of roadway, an engineer unit worked with the urgency of men who knew they were clearing more than debris. Under intermittent fire, they scraped ice, dragged wrecked vehicles aside, and forced a single lane open. The task looked small against the scale of the campaign, but it carried a strategic truth. One cleared lane could keep an entire column moving. One lane could preserve a timetable. One lane could mean Bastogne heard friendly artillery a day sooner. Back at Eisenhower's headquarters, the battle was stitched together across multiple maps: North Shoulder, South Shoulder, Patton's thrust rising toward the pocket. The picture had to be integrated constantly, because a success in one place could create a crisis elsewhere if the roads were not managed as a single system. Coordination was not bureaucracy, it was survival translated into schedules. The deeper revelation of overnight operations was not speed alone, but compressed decision loops. Commanders authorized, rerouted, and prioritized faster than the enemy could adapt, denying him time to turn friction into a trap. That was the real advantage, not outrunning the Germans on the road, but outrunning them in the cycle of decision and response. Now Patton's spearheads were nearing Bastogne, and the map began to tighten into its most expensive shape. The last miles were always the hardest, where movement had to become contact, and contact had to become a corridor before winter, and resistance closed it again. When Patton's lead elements finally met the enemy, the pivot ceased to be mathematics and became friction. Steel tracks bit into frozen ground, engines growled under strain, and infantry moved through fields stiff with winter, where every footstep sounded louder than it should. German resistance was not theatrical, it was practical. Machine guns sighted to cover the only usable road, anti-tank weapons waiting at bends, small groups fighting from stone houses that refused to burn quickly in damp cold. The Ardennes did not offer clean battles. It offered stubborn ones. The relief effort toward Bastogne was framed as a military necessity, but it carried a moral weight that commanders did not need to explain. A surrounded garrison is never only a unit on a map. It becomes a statement about whether an army can protect its own, whether promises have meaning under pressure, whether an alliance can absorb surprise without turning on itself. Inside the bulge, men were fighting for crossroads and fuel. Around Bastogne, men were fighting for credibility. In the town, defenders listened with the patience of the besieged. Their days were measured by shelling patterns, by the dwindling warmth of engines kept idling for minutes at a time, by the careful rationing of ammunition. Then, at some point, in the distance beyond the ring of German pressure, a different sound began to appear. Faint at first, then undeniable. Not German fire, not local skirmishing. Distant artillery, steady and purposeful, like a clock restarting. It was the sound of a larger war remembering them. For a man in a foxhole, that sound did not guarantee rescue, but it proved the world had not forgotten. Patton's promise now became a deadline that no one had to repeat aloud. 2 days was not a boast anymore. It was a measurement against which every stalled vehicle, every contested village, every delayed fuel truck would be judged. Timing became the story because timing decided whether relief arrived as salvation or as too late consolation. The closer the spearheads pushed, the more expensive each mile became, and the more the battle seemed to tighten around the same question: can speed survive contact? At Chef, Eisenhower began receiving updates that changed the atmosphere of the entire campaign. The first reports were cautious: advance elements engaged, resistance stiff, roads contested. Then the tone shifted. Progress continued, coordination held, the thrust did not stall. The bulge was still dangerous, still swelling, but the sense of helpless reaction began to drain away. A coalition that can move reserves rapidly is a coalition that can regain the initiative. Momentum, once returned, becomes its own form of reassurance. The turning point was larger than Bastogne itself. Speed did not merely aim to save a town. It aimed to deny the enemy his psychological victory, the belief that Allied unity would fracture under shock. Patton's thrust signaled that the Allies could pivot, adapt, and strike back faster than the Germans could exploit confusion. The offensive that was meant to split the alliance was now forcing it to act as one. And then the moment that mattered arrived not as a parade, but as a narrow opening. The corridor into Bastogne began to form. Thin at first, contested, vulnerable, but real. A road, a lifeline, a proof. It was enough to show that the bulge could be reversed. But as the first link was made, another reality surfaced. Opening a corridor was not the end of the battle. It was, when the first confirmations arrived that Patton's thrust had reached Bastogne and cracked a corridor into the town, the atmosphere at headquarters changed in a way no map could show. Relief did not sound like celebration. It sounded like breathing again. The bulge still pushed west. German formations still held villages and ridgelines, and the new lifeline was thin enough to be severed. But the essential fact had shifted. A surrounded garrison had been touched, and the enemy's promise of isolation had been broken. Eisenhower's reaction was not theatrical, because coalition command cannot afford theater. It was controlled admiration, recognition without intoxication. He understood exactly what Patton had delivered. A large-scale operational pivot under winter conditions, executed fast enough to deny the Germans time. Yet Eisenhower also understood what praise can do inside an alliance. Praise, if it concentrates too narrowly, becomes a force of politics. It can elevate one national narrative over another, sharpen rivalries between commanders, and make partners feel like they are fighting inside someone else's story. So he emphasized execution rather than personality. In a private room and in public language, he pointed to discipline. The march tables that prevented chaos, the military police who turned roads into arteries, the staff work that anticipated choke points before they formed, the fuel discipline that kept lead elements from stalling in the snow. He spoke, in effect, of the invisible architecture behind the headline. Coalition war cannot worship a single hero for long. It must trust a method, something repeatable, transferable, and sturdy enough to survive the next crisis with a different name. Patton, by nature, wanted the opposite. He wanted the full brightness of the moment. He believed momentum was a weapon that dulled if you hesitated, and he wanted credit not merely as vanity, but as leverage, freedom to keep pressing, freedom to keep moving, freedom to shape the next phase with the same speed that had rescued Bastogne. In that microbeat between the two men, the tension was not personal hatred. It was a conflict of duties. Patton's duty was to strike. Eisenhower's duty was to keep the entire war coherent while striking. Eisenhower's words therefore carried a lesson wrapped inside the compliment. Speed mattered, but only when it served the broader plan. A fast thrust that saved Bastogne was meaningful because it fit into a coordinated response. Shoulders held, reserves positioned, air power readied for when weather cleared, roads managed as a single system rather than 1,000 private urgencies. Speed without coordination becomes roadblock, misallocation, friendly interference, the kind of chaos the Germans had hoped to provoke. Eisenhower needed Patton's tempo, but he needed it obedient to strategy. The moral subtext ran deeper than two famous names. Democracies cannot fight as dictatorships do. They cannot make victory dependent on a single will, because dependence is fragility dressed as strength. They must celebrate competence, because competence deserves celebration, while refusing to turn competence into a cult. In democratic war, institutions must remain larger than individuals, not to diminish brilliance, but to protect the alliance from the moment brilliance becomes irreplaceable. A coalition survives by sharing both burden and glory. Eisenhower's said, whatever its precise phrasing, functioned like a governor on a powerful engine. It acknowledged the horsepower, then controlled it. Keep moving, keep pressure, but remain inside the system that made movement possible. That boundary did not insult Patton. It protected everyone else. It kept other commanders invested rather than resentful. It kept logistics functioning rather than competing. It kept political trust from being eroded by the very victory meant to restore confidence. In that restraint was a quiet kind of courage, and so the climax deepened rather than ended. Patton's triumph was real, but Eisenhower's responsibility was to make it useful, not intoxicating, to convert a dramatic rescue into a stable, shared counteroffensive. Bastogne had been reached, yes. Now the bulge had to be squeezed shut, mile by mile, until the enemy's gamble became a trap of his own making, the beginning of the price that would be paid to hold it. With Bastogne relieved, the story did not end in rescue. It changed into something slower and more punishing. The bulge, once a shock, became a shape that had to be squeezed back into line. The task now was reversal. Restore the original front, reclaim the crossroads and ridges, and make the German gamble pay interest in blood and fuel it could not afford. A breakthrough can be dramatic. The undoing of a breakthrough is often a grind. Patton kept attacking, but the character of his speed had to change. The first rush north was a race against time. Now the fight became winter attrition. Villages taken house by house, roads contested by mines and ambushes, engines failing in cold that did not care which flag flew above a hood. German units, still dangerous, fought with the urgency of men who knew their best chance had already passed. Desperation stiffened resistance. Every mile gained was measured against casualties, and the arithmetic no longer favored quick solutions. Eisenhower, meanwhile, turned the rescue into a coordinated counterstroke. The bulge could not be erased by one thrust alone. It had to be pressed from both sides, north and south shoulders closing like a vice. That required patience in one sector and pressure in another, timing that matched weather, supply, and the movement of reserves. Coalition command returned to its essential work, making many separate efforts feel like one plan, so the enemy could not slip through gaps created by Allied impatience. The human cost became visible in places that never appeared in communiques. Medics worked in frozen barns where the air smelled of iodine and wet wool, hands stiff as they cut away fabric and tried to keep men from dying of shock. There was no triumph in those rooms, only labor, quiet, relentless, and necessary. Victory was being paid for in numb fingers, in blood that steamed briefly before turning dark, in the small losses that accumulate into a ledger no parade can settle. The turning point truth hardened in those days. Bold offensives can fail catastrophically when met by flexible command and rapid redeployment. The Germans had wagered that the Allies would react slowly, fracture, and retreat on separate instincts. Instead, the Allies pivoted, contained, and turned a crisis into a trap. What began as an enemy attempt to split the coalition ended by proving the coalition could absorb shock without breaking. Patton's overnight movement became an institutional lesson. Tempo is not decoration. Tempo is a weapon. It denies the enemy time to consolidate success and forces him to fight inside his own confusion. Yet tempo alone cannot finish a campaign. It must be followed by coordination, endurance, and the willingness to grind when speed runs out. By the time the bulge was contained, the front had been restored, but the winter had already taken its share. The war's last chapter still waited ahead, and the human costs had not finished accumulating. The phrase 2 days traveled fast after the crisis passed. It sounded like a miracle because it was simple, and people prefer simple victories in a complicated war. Yet while the story spread, the casualty lists kept lengthening. Winter victories are never clean. They arrive with frostbite beside shrapnel wounds, with men missing not only to bullets, but to exposure, exhaustion, and accidents on icy roads. The corridor into Bastogne had opened, the bulge had been contained, but the price did not pause to admire the achievement. Patton's style came under re-examination, as it always did when the results were too large to ignore. His brilliance was real, but it demanded suffering as fuel. He treated endurance as a duty, and that duty could feel to the men like a moral commandment. Keep moving, keep pressing, because delay kills. In that logic, there was truth, and there was also danger. Success can harden into ego the way wet cloth hardens in winter. A commander who delivers the impossible may begin to believe the impossible is owed to him, and war has a way of punishing that belief later. Eisenhower's leadership was re-examined too, but in a quieter register. His restraint had prevented panic from spreading down the chain of command and out into political capitals. His authority had taken individual talent, Patton's speed, Bradley's steadiness, Montgomery's caution, and turned it into a single outcome that the coalition could live with. That kind of leadership rarely looks dramatic in the moment. It looks like meetings, words chosen carefully, orders written to keep roads clear and tempers contained. Yet without that restraint, Patton's triumph might have become a spark that ignited rivalry instead of relief. Long after the bulge, soldiers who marched through those nights remembered not glory, but the texture of exhaustion. They remembered the way cold air burned the lungs when you stepped from a truck into darkness. They remembered eating with numb fingers, sleeping in minutes, waking with the engine still running. Victory, in the body, does not feel like speeches. It feels like stiffness, hunger, and a quiet disbelief that you kept going when you thought you could not. In memory, the bulge became a hinge. It proved the Germans could still shock the Western Front late in the war, and it proved the Allies could absorb shock without breaking apart. The same offensive that was designed to fracture trust ended by revealing how much trust had been built between staffs, between nations, between men who had learned to share roads and risk under winter pressure. The lesson underneath the legend was modern and unsentimental. Armies win by adaptability, by the ability to reroute, pivot, and reframe faster than an opponent can exploit confusion. Speed is not only marching fast, it is deciding fast, coordinating fast, repairing fast, and recovering from mistakes before they become disasters. And so the ledger closes on a sober note. What people later call miracles in war are usually just preparation meeting crisis at full speed, paid for in fatigue, fuel, and names typed onto lists that never make the headlines. After the bulge, the public appetite was not for complexity. It was for a story that could fit inside a headline and still feel like victory. A heroic general, an impossible promise, an army moving through snow, a town rescued at the last moment. These were shapes people understood. War, in memory, is often reduced to a single face because faces are easier to remember than supply routes. Patton's dash toward Bastogne offered exactly the kind of narrative a weary audience wanted: motion, certainty, and a dramatic clock. Eisenhower understood that temptation with unusual clarity. He had spent the war managing not only operations but perception, how allies saw each other, how capitals interpreted decisions, how morale survived setbacks. Hero myths are powerful, but in a coalition, they are also volatile. If one nation's public begins to believe the war is being won by one man, then other partners begin to feel like assistants. The myth that lifts morale in one country can quietly injure unity across the alliance. And unity, Eisenhower knew, was the actual foundation of victory. Patton's legend grew quickly because it was useful. It lifted spirits in a winter that had shown the Germans still had claws. It reassured soldiers that speed and aggression still mattered. It gave journalists a protagonist at a time when the war's scale threatened to blur into statistics. But it was also risky for politics. Patton's name could be weaponized by factions inside the alliance, used to argue for one strategy over another, one commander's authority over another, one nation's primacy over another. In wartime, myths are tools. Tools can build. Tools can also cut. A small moment captured the process. A reporter, cold and hurried, typed a headline that would travel farther than any convoy. Patton to the rescue, Patton keeps his promise, Patton saves Bastogne. Somewhere nearby, a staff officer read it and winced, not out of jealousy, but out of recognition. Headlines rarely include the quiet machinery of war. They do not name the military policeman standing at a frozen intersection at 2 a.m., turning chaos into flow. They do not praise the fuel officer rationing gasoline like medicine, or the engineer clearing a lane under fire so the timetable does not die. Yet those men, anonymous by design, are often the ones who make a commander's brilliance possible. That is the deeper truth behind overnight movement. It is a staff achievement as much as a commander's. A single mind can demand speed. Only a system can produce it. The pivot north required a culture of discipline built over weeks, redundancy in communication, practiced recovery procedures, route planning, traffic control, and a headquarters that could compress decision cycles faster than the enemy could exploit confusion. Patton was the symbol, sometimes the necessary symbol, but the instrument was collective. Eisenhower's response, the said that anchored the title, became history's quiet correction. Praise the feat, yes. Recognize the courage and competence it required, but honor the system that made it repeatable and the coalition that made it meaningful. Eisenhower had to keep the story from becoming a single-man religion, because religions can divide even when they inspire. In the end, the bulge was won not only by speed, but by coherence, by an alliance that absorbed shock and answered with coordination. Yet the post-war world would not remember every pin on the map or every schedule in a staff folder. It would remember different heroes for different purposes. Patton as the legend of motion, Eisenhower as the architect of unity. And in that split memory lay a final irony, because the war had been won by both, at once, in the same winter. The title brings us back to a quieter battlefield than Bastogne's outskirts. What Eisenhower said matters because it reveals how democracies must treat brilliance, admire it, rely on it when necessary, even celebrate it, but never surrender to it. War tempts nations to seek salvation in a single man because a single man is easier to understand than 1,000 interlocking systems. Yet democracies survive by refusing that temptation. They win by turning exceptional talent into shared capability, not into dependency. Patton's overnight pivot remains a triumph of tempo, discipline, and will. In winter, under pressure, an army changed direction and arrived fast enough to deny the enemy time. It looked like instinct, almost animal, as if Third Army were one organism responding to threat. But it was not instinct. It was structure made visible. March tables obeyed, routes controlled, fuel positioned, breakdowns recovered, traffic turned into flow. 2 days was a number, but it was also a culture. Men trained to treat delay as defeat, and to keep moving when comfort and sleep had already been rationed away. Eisenhower's response was a different kind of triumph. It was governance in a battlefield uniform, keeping the alliance intact while unleashing speed at the decisive moment. He did not merely accept Patton's promise, he contained it inside a larger plan that held the shoulders, managed the roads, and protected trust between nations. In a coalition, the most dangerous failure is not a lost town. It is a lost belief that the partnership is fair, coherent, and worth obeying. Eisenhower's leadership was the quiet work of preventing that belief from cracking even as the front line tried to. Years later, a veteran might describe those days not as glory, but as a blur. Cold roads under blackout, taillights dimmed like embers, engines running while men slept in minutes. He might remember eating without warmth, moving without conversation, following orders because the map had made time visible. Victory, felt in the body, was stiffness and exhaustion, and the strange knowledge that you had been part of something too large to fully see. The lesson settles with the winter. In war, Speed saves lives. It shortens sieges, restores initiative, and denies an enemy the comfort of consolidation. But in politics, restraint preserves meaning. It keeps alliances from becoming rivalries and success from becoming a cult. The final irony is that what looked like pure improvisation was actually the product of systems built in patience, rehearsed discipline, meeting crisis at full speed. In 2 days, Patton moved an army. Yet Eisenhower's words reminded everyone that the true miracle was the discipline that kept it one war, not many.